Good evening. Welcome to the London Library and today's session. Today we are starting this year philosophy talks, 4 Wednesdays, the same time, the same place. Today is the first one, and the title is Climate Change for all of them. Our guest and presenter today is Professor Myrvold. So please welcome our guest.
Thank you for coming. Thank you, Margaret. Thanks to the London Central Library for hosting us here. Let me begin. The street fight of my title comes from an editorial in the journal Nature from a couple years ago, from 2010. Starts out saying, the integrity of climate research has taken a very public battering in recent months. Scientists must now emphasize the science while acknowledging that they are in a street fight. Strong words from one of the leading science journals, but justified, I think, and chosen carefully. I mean, what's the difference between a street fight and a boxing match? Yeah.
There are rules and regulations in a boxing match, but in a street fight, it's hurtful.
Yeah, and anything goes. And what the editorial writer was telling scientists, you're playing a game that's very different from the rule-governed games of scientific discourse that you're used to. You're out in a political, like you didn't plan on it, but you're out in a political arena where things are very different from the way they are in the academic world you're used to. And I want to talk about what that street fight is, what it consists of, and most importantly, why it happens and how we got here. In order to do that, I'm going to go back. I'm going to go back 50 years. Who's that? Thank you, yes, Rachel Carson. Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, was a landmark book in the environmental movement. For those of A lot of you are going to be familiar with it. For those of you who don't know, Rachel Carson was an ecologist, and she was warning about the effects of DDT and other pesticides on, on bird populations in particular, but on ecosystems in general. So that book was published in 1962, and it had an effect. It got a movement going. Within 10 years, a little over, the use of DDT was banned in the US. Most uses of it were phased out in Canada by the mid-70s, and it was completely discontinued by 1985. Now, something that happened after the publication, in that intervening time, is the pesticide industry fought back. There was an orchestrated campaign to discredit Rachel Carson and her work. But it basically took them off guard, and they weren't ready for the impact that Silent Spring made. Now, if you go to business school these days, the first thing they tell you is be proactive. And another thing they tell you is, don't wait for crises to happen. Anticipate threats to your business and have an action plan in case. So it's routine now for corporations whose businesses might be affected by something like that, some kind of scientific evidence that their product is harmful, or a shift in public opinion, or something like that, to hire PR companies to identify possible threats to their business and have action plans in place. These are strictly confidential, of course. But what I'm going to do is quote one that actually happened to get leaked out. It's published in a lovely book called Trust Us, We're Experts by some gentlemen by Rampton and Stauber. It was prepared for Clorox by PR firm Ketchum. draft crisis management plans. So Clorox hired the Ketchum PR firm to think of possible threats to this business, possible crises, and to develop plans to crisis scenarios and develop plans to deal with them. And they did that. So here's one, crisis scenario number 2. I skipped one. In this scenario, a prominent newspaper columnist targets the environmental hazards of liquid chlorine breach, and consumers begin turning to safer natural cleaning products such as vinegar and borax. Crisis. How do you handle it? Here's what the PR firm recommended in such if there were such an outbreak of disaster. Response plan. An independent scientist is dispatched to meet with the columnist and discuss the issue. Teams of scientists, independent or from Clorox or both, are dispatched to the 10 major US cities to conduct media tours. If you work for a PR firm, eventually you become totally impervious to irony. And you can write things like, an independent scientist is dispatched. Now, what they mean is someone who doesn't actually work for Clorox, is not an employee. Independent in that sense. But this is someone who the company would have already cultivated a relationship with, and but can present himself as an uninterested third party. So imagine this columnist writes this newspaper, and someone not working for Clorox calls you up and said, well, I've studied this issue, and I think maybe you're wrong about this. Maybe you want to read it. So teams of scientists are dispatched to 10 major US cities. And if you're going to do this, you have to cultivate the relationship with these scientists in advance. Here's another one. Crisis scenario number 3. In this stereo, a national toxicology program study concludes that chlorine is an animal carcinogen attracting widespread media coverage. Response plan. Again, third party, not actually working for Clorox. Scientific experts are brought to Washington to testify and advise both Congress and the EPA. Third party spokespeople are scheduled for major television and newspaper interviews. Industry generates grassroots letters to legislators calling on them to show restraint. Another case of being irony blind, and actually, if you Google it, there's a number of PR companies that specialize, that advertise as their services. They specialize in generating grassroots letters campaign. And what they do is, they put. Actually, I don't know if they use email these days, but what they used to do is get people on the phone, and they call people up and say, "Have you heard about this?" And if the person, if the person expresses any concern, you say, "Well, would you like to write a letter to your congressperson or to your MP?" "Well, I don't know if I have time." "We'll help you," and then they transfer them to someone who is going to help them write the letter. The letter could actually be generated at the PR firm. If you're really good at it, they'll have little kitty cat stationery if it's coming from a little old lady. There'll be personalized letters. I'm not making this up. PR firms advertise these as their services. Okay. Now, notice in both of these, there's an emphasis on third party. Because, we've learned that we're not going to trust someone who works for Clorox telling us that chlorine breach is safe, right? We're not that naive. So, and this in the PR industry is called the third man strategy. You want to present to be persuasive. You want to present your viewpoint as if it's coming from a neutral third party. And one strategy is to set up ostensibly independent research organizations whose job it is to, say, research the health effects of secondhand smoke, but are entirely funded by the tobacco industry. And this was a strategy which was pioneered by the tobacco industry. There was something called the Tobacco Institute, whose purpose was to generate things that looked like scientific reports about trying to show that secondhand smoke is actually not unsafe. And part of the reason we know about this, again, all of this stuff, of course, doesn't work if it's public knowledge, right? Part of the reason we know about this is in the U.S. there was a major class action suit of from family and relatives of people who had died of lung cancer or people who were in treatment. A class action suit aimed at showing that the tobacco industry knew about the hazards of secondhand smoke and were repressing that evidence. And as part of that suit, gobs and gobs and gobs of what would have been ordinary confidential documents got subpoenaed and became a part of the public record. So the secondhand smoke and tobacco thing is one case where we have lots of information about what happened going on behind the scenes. But you shouldn't think that it's special to that particular industry. As I said, if they're doing their job, the management of every major corporation is doing its best to anticipate crisis scenarios, ward them off, and if there's any chance of legislation that's going to adversely affect their business, they're doing their best to ward that off. But as I said, we know a lot about what happened in the tobacco industry. And people who've written about this have called this the tobacco strategy, the strategy of establishing ostensibly independent think tanks or research institutes whose job it is to present the industry's point of view as if it's coming from an objective scientific study. All right. So, as I said, faced with the threat of anti-smoking legislation, the tobacco industry began a PR campaign to create the impression that there was a high degree of uncertainty regarding links between smoking and adverse health effects. There was something called the Tobacco Institute, formed to seek out independent scientists to cast doubt. But the PR firms that Reynolds and other people hired, they were smart and said, well, if all these think tanks are popping up that are all about tobacco, people are going to get it, right? So what they suggested was, APCO, a PR firm, Philip Morris says, let's found something a bit more broad-based. They founded something called the Advancement of Sound Science Coalition. The V was put on after someone had pointed out that it was just an Advancement of Sound Science Coalition. It was ASS Coalition. But so what they did is they put together a consortium of not just tobacco firms, but other firms that might be worried about certain things affecting their bottom line, and they put that together and to combat concerns about, say, global warming, nuclear waste disposal, and biotechnology. And I'm primarily interested in the climate science thing, but it's partly because these a lot of the same organizations, the same campaign, same organizations which were casting doubt on the effects of secondhand smoke also got in the casting doubt on climate science business. We have documents, memos that would have ordinarily been confidential. So, actually, there's a bit. The Advancement of Sound Science Coalition employed someone named Steve Malloy as director. One of the products of the campaign was his junk science website, which is still going. Anyone familiar with the name Steve Malloy? If you watch Fox, you might have seen him on as a science correspondent. So he would do segments on Fox, not mentioning that in addition to working for Fox, he's also working for APCO, which is paid by Philip Morris and Exxon and other things to cast doubt on certain claims about that we should be concerned about certain things. But all right. So one of the organizations that got formed as a part of this PR campaign was something called the Global Climate Condition. It lasted till 2002 when people started catching on to it. These organizations tend to have limited lives, but if one of them gets disbanded, then other ones pop up to take their place. So even though I'm talking about things that have been since disbanded, the campaign goes on. So it was funded by a bunch of people who were really concerned about the prospect of meaningful legislation or meaningful agreements limiting carbon emissions. AMICO, American Forest and Paper Association, American Petroleum Institute, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. In the time between 1994 to 2001, they spent more than $63 million on this campaign. Just to put that in perspective, total lobbying by all environmental groups in the US on all issues, not just climate change, was less than 5 million during that time period. Okay. Here's another organization, the Global Climate Science Team. This is a memo setting it up. Project goal. A majority of the American public, including industry leadership, recognizes the significant uncertainties exist in climate science and therefore raises questions among those, e.g. Congress, who chart the future U.S. course on global climate change. Progress will be measured towards the goal. A measurement of the public's perspective on climate science will be taken before the plan is launched, and the same measurement will be taken at one or more as yet to be determined intervals as the plan is implemented. Okay. Victory will be, this is the same memo, achieved when average citizens understand uncertainties in climate science, recognition of uncertainties become part of the conventional wisdom. So everybody is supposed to, as a result of this, is supposed to just know that when you hear about climate science, you're supposed to say, well, the science isn't settled. Media understands, I find it interesting that they put understand in quotes. Recognize uncertainties in climate science. Media coverage reflects balance on climate science and recognition of the validity of viewpoints that challenge the current conventional wisdom. I'll have a word to say about balance later. Industry senior leadership understands uncertainties in climate science, making them stronger ambassadors to those who shape climate policy. And those promoting the Kyoto Treaty on the basis of extant, it's supposed to be science, appear to be out of touch with reality. So that's the goal of this campaign. There's evidence that the campaign has been somewhat successful. This is Gallup polls from 2001 to 2014. I know it might be hard to read in the back, but the dark green are concerned believers. So these people who say, yes, I do believe that climate change is occurring. It is the bulk of the climate change in the past 150 years is caused by the increase of greenhouse gases due to human causes, and I'm concerned about it. That, in 2001, that was 39%, went up a bit, and then took a hit in 2009, 2010, et cetera, back up to 39 by 2014. What's more interesting is what happened in the other ones. The light green is the mixed middle, people who are uncertain, and the lightest green, or yellow, is what they call cool skeptics, or the hardcore skeptics. So what really, the real change is since we started, 39 here and 39 here, what happened is that the ranks of the uncertain went down and the ranks of the skeptics went up. And I think what happens, we have like more or less steady among the believers is, and the impression I get just reading things in the newspapers and venturing out into the blogosphere is that there are more or less self-enclosed bubbles. Like there are a whole bunch of websites and news sources that basically act as an echo chamber that repeat the same things over and over again. And as I suspect, there are a lot of people who never venture out of that bubble because they've been told that climate science is just a conspiracy by the liberal media. And what the impression is that what this campaign has done is brought some people who are less undecided into that bubble. Okay, here is a recent one. This is from last year, from June 2013. Might be too small to read, but the 4 categories are: first, global warming is a fact and is mostly caused by emissions from vehicles and industrial facilities. Canada, 58% agree to that. US, 47%. Britain, 45%. So at least we're greater than half. But still, 58%. Because I mean, that's not controversial. It's not, among scientists, it's not a controversial statement. Global warming is a fact and is mostly caused by natural changes, 20, 22, 23. Global warming is a theory that's not yet been proven, 13, 2019, and then not sure, 9, 11, 13. So, the numbers agreeing with what the scientists are telling us is, under 1/2, at least in 2013, under 1/2 in the United States and Britain, and, bigger than 1/2 in Canada, but.
The third column, what does the percentage mean?
Percentage of, so in the third column?
Global warming is a theory that's not been proven. What does the percentage mean?
Those are the percentage of people agreeing to that. So the respondents are given a choice of which one of these 4 which one of these 4 things.
So 13% of people don't agree that it's a theory, or it is a theory?
The key thing is that has not yet been proven. Yeah, right. Yeah, but yeah, I mean, it's yeah. So that's the key phrase in that. A theory that's not yet been proven is what they're being asked to agree to. Yeah. Do you get it? No? Basically, they're being asked, how strongly do you believe what the scientists are telling you? Are you pretty sure it's true? Then you're in the first thing. If you think that global warming is happening, but it's mostly caused by natural changes, then you'll tick the second box. I think the third one is aimed at people who are skeptical that global warming is happening at all. Right. So that's 20 and 19. Okay. So as a word about bias or balance. Journalists are trained to get both sides of the issue. And so for example, if there's some policy proposed by the government, you're gonna quote both the government spokesperson and someone from the opposition party, right? If you only quote one side of a political debate, then it's unbalanced coverage. You're biased. One of the things that these PR companies realized is that they could exploit that to their advantage. Because what you do is you set up these think tanks, you have these people who are aggressively cultivating contacts with reporters and saying, if you want the other side of the story, you can always call me. And so what you got for a long time, and I think it's still happening, is that every time there was a news story reporting on some report by a group of climate scientists or some finding, then you would not only report the scientists, then you get somebody from some institute, often with no scientific background whatsoever, quoted also as if this person were an equally credible source. It still goes on. If you don't believe me, just start looking at these things. And the great thing about the internet is, you can Google these people and you find find out their scientific background. I teach a course on environmental philosophy at Western, and I have my students do that. And sometimes I'll just pick one at random, and we'll just do it in class. So one time I did this. There was a study by a atmospheric physicist named Carrie Emanuel, who was arguing, and this was in the wake of Katrina, that there was evidence that increased severity of tropical storms was indeed due to global warming. And the headline says, Katrina ignites debate over global warming. And it was presented as debate. And on the other side of the debate was a guy named Roger Pielke Jr., who doesn't even pretend to be an atmospheric scientist. He studies policy having to do with catastrophic loss. And you can look at his website, and he's got a list of things I'm expert in. And climate science was not one of them. But it was presented in the news story as if this was, and this other guy was, and you could look at his website, MIT, 40 years of studying nothing but hurricane dynamics. Right. But balance was in the reporter's eyes, required reporting both of these as if they have equal weight. And there was a study on this by a group called Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting of articles in major newspapers. They found that 53% of the articles gave roughly equal attention to the views that humans contribute to global warming, and the climate change is exclusively the result of natural fluctuations. Okay, why not give equal attention to the views? Well, the reason is that if you actually are talking to someone whose job it is to study climate, they're going to say, no, we've looked at the natural fluctuations, and they're not enough to account for the warming we've seen in the 150 years. So when these people are putting equal weight to them, they're on one hand somebody who actually works on the science and someone who's just presented themselves as willing to give the opposite view, whether they have any credentials or not. 35% emphasize the roles of humans while presenting both sides of the debate, which more accurately reflects scientific thinking and warning. 6% emphasize doubts. Another 6% only included the predominant scientific view. Only 6%. This is from a nice article, and I like the title, Journalistic Balance as Global Warming Bias. Right. Or say the laudable attempt at bias, at balance created bias, I think is the way to put it. Okay. If you're interested in sort of money involved, how much has gone into funding these various think tanks, organizations whose job it is to do nothing except cast doubt on what the scientists are saying. This is something from, sort of unusual to have this article in a journal called Climatic Change, which is primarily usually a scientific journal. So it's these are estimates from up from a little over 0.6 billion in 2008 to 1.2 billion in 2010. Those are the years that were presented in that study. Don't think that it stopped in 2010. $1.2 billion spent in the US to mislead people about climate science. Not just anything, but specifically about climate science. Okay. Other tactics in this campaign are use of freedom of information requests to tie up scientists' time. When Freedom of Information Acts were first put into place, and they're very good things. Public supported science should be public. There was a worry that, actually they were primarily thinking of animal rights activists and animal experiment things, is that activists could use, or other people who were unhappy about the sort of research being done, would just plague scientists with request after request after request, and they created the category of vexatious requests. So basically, just to bother the person, just to keep the person tied up with their time responding to these requests. And typically, the rule is that if it's a frivolous or vexatious request, you don't have to respond to it. If you look at, if you venture into this bubble of the anti-climate science blogosphere, people make much of the fact that a scientist named Phil Jones eventually got fed up and said, with a particular blogger, and said, "I'm not responding to your Freedom of Information Act requests anymore." They don't emphasize is that he consulted his university's FOI office and did that under the advice of the person in charge of complying with the laws on that. So this is something that has been used. In November 2009, and this is largely what that editorial in Nature is responding to, a huge collection of hacked emails from a research unit in England was stolen and published. And then what you got coming to that is, people mined those for quotes that they could take out of context and which would suggest either wrongdoing or fraud. And a lot of these quotes still continue to float around the internet. There have been actually, quite a few of the scientists involved. Their universities got concerned. There's been multiple investigations by independent bodies about whether those emails actually show any wrongdoing or fraud, and no actual scientific misconduct, no actual evidence of fraud. Some of the things they said weren't nice, and the sort of thing that probably shouldn't have been said, but nonetheless, in 2010, the Virginia Attorney General launched a fraud investigation aimed at the climatologist Michael Mann, who for a while worked at the University of Virginia. And so that's how the Attorney General gets in, is that was this person using our taxpayer money back then to commit scientific fraud? The courts in Virginia said, no, you can't do that. you have no grounds for this investigation. The subpoenas were dismissed. Subpoenas, for the record, were dismissed as baseless. The last ruling I could find was by the Virginia Supreme Court in 2012, and I think that put an end to that. But for 2 years, Michael Mann had to work with this threat of a fraud investigation going. All right. This is a charming billboard campaign by the Heartland Institute, which is one of the major players these days in the, I don't know what to call it. People like to use the word skeptic, but that suggests, skeptic has to do with a state of belief. And if you're involved in a PR campaign whose sole purpose is by any means necessary to block meaningful action on climate change, it doesn't matter what you believe, right? You're going to do whatever you want, right? So people don't like the word denialist. Sometimes it's called a disinformation campaign, whatever. But so anyways, Heartland Institute, and whatever you want to call that campaign, the Heartland Institute is a major player these days. In 2012, they put up these less than subtle billboards. That went a little too far, and there was backlash, and they they took those down and said that was not a good idea. How many of you know the name Mark Stein? He writes for Maclean's. He writes for the National Review. He also does guest spots on Rush Limbaugh when Rush Limbaugh's radio show when Limbaugh takes a break. Anyways, here is a column that he wrote, published in the National Review, called 2012. And I'm sorry, that's just too small to see. Yeah. Yeah, so I'm going to read it to you. All right, yeah, right. Yeah, it actually is a bit blurry. I think we don't have perfect focus. Anyways.
Yeah.
Oh, that's better. Okay. It's still too small to see, but anyways, at least it's not blurry anymore. In the wake of Louis Freeh reports on Penn State's complicity in serial rape, you remember Penn State, Gary Sandusky, ugly, thing. Rand Simberg writes of Unhappy Valley's other scandal, because Michael Mann was at Penn State by that time. I'm referred to another cover-up and whitewash that occurred there 2 years ago, before we learned how rotten and corrupt the culture at the university was. But now that we know how bad it was, perhaps it's time that we revisit the Michael Mann affair, particularly given how much we've also learned about his and others' hockey stick deceptions since. The reference to the hockey stick has to do with a graph that occurs in a paper co-authored by Michael Mann. They did a reconstruction of the temperatures going back to, I don't know how long, 1,000 years, thank you. And you get fluctuations, but you get a fairly steep upturn at the end, and it got called the hockey stick.
Why?
What's that? Why? Why? It got called the hockey stick because of the shape. Yeah. Okay. Man could be said to be the Gary Sandusky of climate science, except that instead of molesting children, he has molested and tortured data in the service of politicized science that could have dire economic consequences to the nation and planet. Not sure. So that's a quote from Rand Simberg. And then Stein comes back and says, not sure I've extended that metaphor all the way into the locker room showers with quite the zeal Mr. Simberg does. But he has a point. Michael Mann was the man behind the fraudulent climate change hockey stick graph, the very ringmaster of the tree ring circus. A lot of these temperature reconstructions had to do with tree rings. And when the East Anglia emails came out, Penn State felt obliged to investigate Professor Mann. Graham Spanier, the Penn State president, forced to resign over Sandusky, was the same cove who investigated Mann. Right? And as with Sandusky and Paterno, the college declined to find one of his star names guilty of any wrongdoing. Okay. Right. So what we have is Mark Stein calling the graph fraudulent. Michael Mann, and I think this is actually an interesting case, and it's still going on, but it'd be interesting to see how it comes out, because really the PR campaign has been conducted under the rules of a street fight, namely no rules whatsoever. And I think it's actually an interesting legal question. Do people have a legal right to accuse scientists or climate scientists of fraud without any evidence? Or actually with evidence to the contrary, because those accusations of fraud about that particular paper, it's been reviewed by numerous bodies, and the conclusion over and over again is that there's no evidence of any wrongdoing. So it's still going on. The National Review has attempted to get the thing dismissed out of court. They tried to use anti-SLAPP legislation, SLAPP, strategic lawsuit against public participation. Basically, if it is a SLAPP, it's a frivolous lawsuit without any ground. The National Review has tried to get the suit dismissed, and it's going on. The latest thing I was able to find on this was in August, the National Review appealed the decision to reject their request of the dismissal. So yeah, if you can. And one argument I found interesting is they said, he said, no, it's not against the rules to call people fraudulent without evidence, because that's just part of the game in political discourse. Read in context, this is from their appeal. Read in context, Stein's commentary was protected rhetorical hyperbole, not a literal accusation of fraud or data falsification. And then they go on to say, in the heat of public controversy, terms like fraudulent and molested and tortured data are common epithets for expressing disagreement. Such vigorous rhetoric is simply a shorthand way of expressing disagreement, not an allegation of fraud or data falsification in any literal sense. Now, the problem with that is, you're saying, okay, Mark Stein, so this is National Review's lawyer saying this. Stein fired his lawyers. He's going on his own. And Stein isn't helping the National Review on this, because if they want to argue he didn't really mean fraud, that doesn't help. So this, so this is Stein. Stein's blog from May 2014, headline, Michael E. Mann, liar, cheat, falsifier, and fraud. Okay, so it'll be interesting to see how this lawsuit turns out. If, in fact, Mann wins, it might have a sort of cooling effect on the kind of rhetoric. Things like the National Review and other things really don't want to get sued for defamation. So we'll see how that goes. Okay. And there are signs, there's been a number of books about this PR campaign. People are becoming aware of it. And there are good signs that it's running into some troubles. One of the organizations that's been involved in this and many other things is the American Legislation Exchange Council. And one of America's biggest corporations has now pulled out of that because they're not happy about the exchange, the ALEC quote lying about climate change. Okay. Now, one question that I asked myself, and it's not just climate science. you have to be aware that this is just a basic fact about our society, that any time that there's any threat that some certain scientific developments or scientific results are going to cut into the profits of some industry, there are people whose job it is to discredit that. And it can be difficult to know what to believe. Because I don't know about you, I don't have time to read all, get down into the details of the science of climate science and everything else. And what I would suggest is, burst out of the bubble. If there's people telling you one thing and other people telling you another thing, read both sides. There's a nice website called Skeptical Science. I mentioned that in the denialist or skeptic or whatever bubble, a lot of the same sound bites just get repeated over and over and over again. And in a lot of cases, the reply is out there and just gets disregarded because they're assuming you're trapped in the bubble. One place to look to see if there's actually a reply out there is this website called Skeptical Science. They have a list of what they had called the most used climate myths. And what you can do is you can say, okay, I read this on this website or in this editorial. You can go to this and say, well, okay, is that one of those things that they have a reply to? We read about it. And then go back. Say the other side have a reply to that. And here's just one example. Most recent one I've seen, this is an editorial in the Wall Street Journal. Sorry, the Washington Post has had similar ones, but this is the Wall Street Journal. Published on September 19th, so not so long ago. And it has a lot of points that, if you read the sort of thing you've seen before. Let me just pick one of them. Because talking about climate models attempting to make predictions. The computer models roughly, the models roughly describe the shrinking extent of Arctic sea ice observed over the past 2 decades, but they fail to describe the comparable growth of Antarctic sea ice, which is now at a record high. Did you know that? Did you know that the Antarctic ice is increasing?
I thought we lost that bee shell like a couple of years ago. That's grown back since.
You've got you say it right. You're talking about ice shelves. Unlike the Arctic, most of the Antarctic ice cap is on land. And that's disappearing at a accelerating rate.
Not for the last 2 years.
I'll get to that. A lot of it's going into the sea. So the actual area covered by sea ice in the Antarctic is increasing. But the total amount of ice in the Antarctic is decreasing. He doesn't tell you that. If you look at, Antarctic is gaining sea ice but losing land ice at an accelerating rate, which has implications for sea level rise. From the same website, all the sea ice talk aside, it's quite clear that when it comes to Antarctic ice and sea levels, sea ice is not the most important thing to measure. In Antarctica, the largest and most important ice mass is the land ice of the West Antarctic and East Antarctic ice sheets. And that's losing mass at an accelerating rate. Now, I'm glad you mentioned this 2 years thing. Because all of this talk is about long-term trends. And there's a lot of variability from year to year. well, heck, it's October, the weather's getting colder as we get into winter. That doesn't mean that every day is colder than the previous day. There's fluctuations. Or I recently took up bowling, and I've been getting better. But you know what? It's not true that every game is my best ever. So what some people can do is they can look at my bowling score month after month, and they can pick the last time I set a record, which was a month ago. That's the last time I actually bowled better than I ever did before, and start and say, well, since then you're going downhill, because none has been good like that. So yeah, another thing that you get as a very common thing is, you look at a long-term noisy trend. It's true that not every single year is going to set a record. Not every single year is going to, in the Arctic, is going to set a record for all-time low of Arctic sea ice. And start there and say, well, it's bouncing back. Well, it's not. Okay. If you don't believe me, don't believe me. Don't just take my word for it. The data is out there about the sea ice. NOAA, in the U.S., the National Climate Data Center has wonderful data on amounts of sea ice. The NOAA in the U.S. has wonderful data series for temperatures. Yeah, don't take my word for it. Go look. Just play with it. You can. They've got an interactive thing to show graphs. So I mean, another thing that another talking point that people often make is, I wish I had this graph, is global surface temperatures. If you just look at surface and ignore the oceans. 1998 was a particularly warm year, and if you start your time period in 1998, it's hard to see the long-term trend there. However, you look at the graph of temperatures over the past 150 years, the trend is there. So if people talk about a global warming pause or a hiatus in warming, that's what they're talking about. But it's the same thing as expecting every time I go bowling, I'm going to set a record. It fluctuates a lot. I'm getting better and better and better. But it's a noisy trend, and it's the long-term trends that matter. So it's just not true that if I don't bowl this week as well as I did last week, that I'm not on an upward, on an improving slope. Okay, I want to talk about why it happens. There's a good reason that this is going on. It's, money. If you're the CEO of ExxonMobil or other major fossil fuel extraction companies, and you're writing your annual report or your quarterly report, and you're listing your assets, you include, among other things, oil, coal, and gas reserves that you've identified but have not yet dug up. And in fact, analysts pay a lot of, stock market analysts pay a lot of attention to that. If a oil company doesn't have identified reserves to continue its sales growth for the next 10 years, that's a real warning flag when it comes to their valuation of the company. So if those are to be above ground, then they're not going to be worth anything to the company. So if I were the CEO of ExxonMobil, and I woke up tomorrow morning and said, you know what, what all these guys are saying about climate change is right. I think all that oil should stay in the ground. If I were then to say that publicly, saying my company intends to leave all those identified oil reserves in the ground, I would be instantly removing a large chunk of the assets of my company from the balance sheet. And I would be as quickly removed from my job and replaced by someone who isn't going to do that. Count up all the identified carbon fuels in the ground, that's $27 trillion. If we decided tomorrow that was going to raise in the ground, that means $27 in assets lost to the fuel extraction companies. So yeah, they're going to spend money to prevent that. If it's a publicly traded company, they actually have a fiduciary obligation to their shareholders to try to do everything they can to prevent that. To spend now that billions of dollars spent on this campaign now looks piddly compared to what's at stake, trillions of dollars of assets. Okay, all right. And I think what they're really afraid of is we don't have to dig it up. We could make a transition to a much greener energy. There's an organization called Blue Green Canada wrote a report that estimates that if we just took the $1.3 billion in government subsidies that we're currently giving, Canadian government subsidies, currently giving to the oil and gas sector, if they were invested in renewable energy and energy efficiency, we wouldn't lose jobs, we could actually create more jobs than would be lost in the oil and gas sector. So the fear is that a different world is possible. And the fear is that people like you are going to demand that it be created. And I just want to end with this quote. The climate justice fight here in the US and around the world is not just a fight against the biggest ecological crisis of all time. It's a fight for a new economy, a new energy system, a new relationship to the planet and to each other, for land, water, and food sovereignty, for indigenous rights, for human rights, and for the dignity of people. When climate justice wins, we win the world that we want. If you'd like to hear more about these topics, I would like to recommend that you join us on October 23rd for a panel discussion on climate change policy. We have 3 of the participants here in the audience. The 4th is Jeffrey Simpson, of the Globe and Mail, who couldn't make it tonight. And so, please come and have a listen to what these people have to say and bring your ideas. Thank you.
May I say something?
Yes, please do.
I guess I represent the Department of Botany, UWO. And I guess I also represent Professor Essex from the Department of Geology and Geography. And I also represent the father of paleontology, paleoclimatology, because that's really what we're talking about here. We're looking at the climate record. And I think the greatest advice that I can ever give you, and I am a skeptic, and I'm beyond a skeptic. I feel the manipulation as being on the other side as a science person. I've spent my entire life in this. And I think the best quote you'll ever get on this topic is from Einstein, when he says, in your search for truth, those that go to consensus will incur the laughter of the gods. He's referring to Galileo's battle in the 15th century. And I find it, I accept the fact that you're in philosophy, but it annoys me a little bit. But I'm glad you come up with some of the facts, because I think that's where it's at, and that's where we should stick it to. And to think that it is a consensus is far beyond the truth. You look up paleoclimatologists, how many disagree with the Michael Mann? And Michael Mann, that hockey stick draft he made is an embarrassment to us. And I think that should have been discussed. But anyways, I'll leave it up to other people to make other comments.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I absolutely agree with you. Don't just believe things just because there's a consensus. The consensus could be wrong. If you want to know, that's how, so you might have noticed the word consensus actually never occurred in my talk.
It occurs with Al Gore and Suzuki and Mann.
Right. The word consensus never occurred in my talk. What I urge people to do if they want to know who to believe, look at the arguments on both sides. Yeah, Rado.
Yes, rather than Rotman, political scientist, that question as well. I really am very genuinely curious about the factual foundation of your views and your statement, and I wonder whether you would elaborate a little bit on this. And perhaps we can just ignore individuals, because I'm personally not impressed or interested by any of the individuals mentioned on either side. I think there's such much more broader issues involved here.
Well, I think maybe the first thing that we have to understand is the father of this business that we're studying now about the climate is Dr. Don Stark. He just died a few years ago, and he made a famous bet. It's called the red wine bet, and he said by 2040 it's going to turn very cold. And if you look at the graphs, what he suggested by 2010, the warming trend will come off. There's so many things, so many facts to say about this topic. I gave a talk about a week or two ago on this very thing in this very room. Maybe I'll give it again next year, right? I always give a talk. I'll give another one at Western in a few weeks. But anyway, maybe the one important fact, just digest this fact. What is the percentage that we, as an industrial people, contribute to CO2? It varies a bit, but the maximum we contribute is 3.6%. Digest that. We are like fruit flies on the planet. It's the plants that control it. When plants die, they respirate like us. There's a bunch of scientists that worked on a thing called C4 plants. Fascinating. You check it out.
They're cutting down on the forests, eventually all that. So maybe that 3% of the spewing in the air is going to be positive, right?
Can we get someone else first? Yeah. Yes, sir.
A lot of your talk was directed towards the politics of the effects of whoever claims what. If you can talk about tools that, looks like this audience is predominantly an academic audience, tools that academics can bring to the political discussion. Michael Mann and others have all been confronted with the reality of being immersed in a political environment they may not have chosen to be immersed.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And we were actually talking about this earlier. A lot of these people tend not to be very good at communicating science to the public. And I mean, if you read the IPCC reports, they go through discussions of wording and stuff like that, and at the end of the day, you get these things that they're called summary for policymakers, but they're darn near unreadable, to layperson. Like these. It's good. So it's a good question because these scientists aren't trained in public communication. They're not trained. A lot of these people got into the business of climatology long before anyone thought it was going to be political. They tend to be not to be outgoing activist type things. So that's a good question. I'm not sure I have a good answer to that.
So maybe as a follow-up, I was part of the anti-nuclear group in the,
Right.
in
Yeah.
the 80s. In
Right.
the academic sense, there still is a group called Science for Peace,
Mhm.
.ca.
Mhm.
Look it up.
Mhm. Union of Concerned
mostly-
Scientists.
Pardon me?
Union of Concerned Scientists also.
Well, if you're looking for something in Canada,
Mhm.
Science for Peace exists. Some
Mhm.
people in London participate, not
Mhm.
many. Mostly out of the GTA universities. But there are those sorts of things. Now, Science for Peace initially was focused on issues of nuclear weapons, primarily.
Mhm.
There needs to be sort of the equivalent, I think,
Mhm.
amongst academics to ferret out whatever the ways of confronting the politics, but from a more academic / science perspective. Science for Peace is trying to do that. There are a number of initiatives that we've been participating in.
Mhm.
But I would strongly encourage any academics who are interested in that interface
Mhm.
to look it up.
Good, thank you. Thank you for that suggestion.
Thank you for the opportunity. I anticipated coming tonight. I wasn't quite sure what the content and the focus would be, and I was going through the Globe today. I don't know if anybody takes the Globe or not, that's a different topic. And I just wanted to refer to an article from today's Globe. The headline is "Scientists Not Shielded from Politics." Simon Fraser University and Evidence for Democracy say Canadian policies inhibited public access to federal researchers. Lead paragraph. Most scientists who work for the Canadian government are not adequately protected from political interference or assured of being able to speak freely and openly about their work. I don't want to take this down the balances bias road, but I'm wondering if you'd like to comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, thank you for that. That's something that I thought about talking about, and then, in the interest of time, cut out. But yeah, I think that's actually very important. Is the, federal government in Canada. There's a great book called Harper's War on Science. Has gutted the budgets of basically, the scientific agencies that were involved that are involved in informing the government about environmental policy, and then also have put severe restrictions on the ability of government scientists to communicate to the public. They're not allowed to. And there's a group called Evidence for Democracy that has been formed to protest this, and this study just came out yesterday or today or
They're referring to the article as well.
Today, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So I saw that. That it varies from sector to sector, but a large number of Canadian scientists say, no, I'm not free to communicate to the public. Their requests to speak with reporters are supposed to be shunted off to official spokespeople. To the extent that the government had spokespeople following climate scientists around at conferences to make sure that they didn't talk off the record. Yeah. So yeah, it's we should be, and I think that wherever you fall on the political spectrum, whether you vote Liberal, whether you vote Conservative, whether you vote NDP, this is actually a drastic change from any previous federal government's conception of the relationship between the government policy and the scientific agencies. And it's not, it's not something that you've seen in conservative, under the Mulroney regime. Things were very healthy, and the picture I think that most Canadians have always had in their mind, and most federal governments up to the current one is, okay, you let the scientists do their work and they report to the politicians, and then the politicians argue about argue about what's the best policy on that. And our current federal government seems bent on pursuing fact-free policy.
So it's part of the Street Fighter mentality.
Yeah. Yeah, Retta?
Something that I think would be useful for the audience to be aware of. I've had the privilege to be at many of the international conferences, both negotiating climate change policy, as well as some of the meetings of the IPCC themselves. The reason why I'm unimpressed with individuals and who said what and Michael Mann and whoever is because what is more interesting to me is the 2,300 scientists who contributed to, let's say, the 2007 IPCC report. Now, these 2,300 individuals come from 110 countries. Now, let's for a moment forget about their credibility and assume that somehow they're involved in some huge conspiracy to deceive the public and create the impression of global warming. Let's assume that and basically shelve those scientists. The mandate of the IPCC says that if any report is to be adopted, there has to be political consensus, not only scientific consensus, but political consensus among all governments before the report is released. I was very privy inside the negotiations of the 2007 report that took place in Valencia. And I can tell you that not a single government questioned, let's put it very bluntly, climate science. Not a single government did. Not even Saudi Arabia, which is known as, they basically try to carpet bomb anything related to climate change at the international scale. But they do not question the fundamental reality, the causes, and the consequences. Right? The Bush administration's delegations did not question that. And so I find it very peculiar when people somewhere, say, oh, climate change is not happening. How come George W. Bush did not agree with them, right, according to his delegation, or the Saudi government, or, even if all the scientists are some form of conspirators, I think this is a very, very telling fact.
It's simple.
Right?
It's simple. The answer is simple. The chart you put up there and showed, when you got 58% of the Canadian public so disillusioned by the reality of climate change, you're not going to say anything negative against that.
But I still don't understand what is the basis for describing that reality that you see.
Oh, that's my life.
On one hand, we
you
have
come to one of my
2,300 people who are officially part of the IPCC coming from various directions, okay? And they say one thing, and somehow you have reasons to believe that we should be listening to you in Chris Essex, and I'd like to know why. Because this does have implications for my two daughters, and I'd like to know what is the foundation.
Well, number one, I'm not alone. I have 1,300 paleoclimatologists behind me. Check it out in Google. A lot of us don't agree with us.
Yeah.
Because many of the skeptics, I look at their websites and they're bloggers. They wouldn't have actual publications in peer-reviewed journals. Right, and I can tell you names if you'd like, but I don't think we should be so indiscreet.
Yeah, we had a point over here. Yeah.
I suppose I have a follow-up question to the question of tools for academics and sort of the relation between appealing to evidence or appealing to consensus. It seems like the public debate bottoms out really quick at someone saying you don't have proof. It seems to be the trump card that's played is that there isn't scientific consensus. Not everybody agrees, so let's do sound science and just sort of withhold judgment. Do you have much hope for a public discussion about the role of evidence and proof in scientific method, or because I know there are a lot of philosophers of science or philosophers in the room, and proof is a word that doesn't get bandied around in science. But I wonder if you have much hope for telling, using that in public debate. Or if you're just obfuscating.
Yeah. A couple years ago, I was at a dinner sitting next to a climate scientist, and we were talking about how the nature of the public debate. And what he said was, it's your fault. And he didn't mean me specifically. I'm a philosopher of science, by trade. What he meant was that philosophers of science have a role to play in communicating to the public, not the science, but scientific method. Scientists don't use the word proof, right? They use the word evidence. Scientists know, you're never going to be absolutely certain of something, and but basically everything. But so if you look at the the way the IPCC says it, they say the predominance of the evidence, and they actually try to talk about how sure they are of certain things and how sure they're more sure of certain things, less sure about other things. I think that's very important. So I think that there is a role for philosophers of science to play in the public discussion, and there's an increasing number of philosophers of science who say, yeah, we should get more publicly engaged. Got one in the room here. And also an important point that needs to be made is, well, okay, suppose I'm not sure, absolutely sure, that the sort of catastrophic, if the scientists are right, business as usual, which isn't, holding our carbon emissions, steady. Business as usual is continued acceleration of that carbon. That 27 trillion. So the scientists say, well, to avoid really catastrophic change, we need to hold it something less than a 2-degree warming. If they're right about that, and if they're right about the effects of carbon dioxide on the climate, most of those reserves have to stay in the ground. That's like 5 times more than we can afford to burn and to stay at that 2-degree target. Now, maybe I'm not absolutely certain that the scientists are right. Well, we all know what you do when you make decisions in the face of uncertainty. If my mechanic looks at my brakes and say, if you keep going on this, I can't tell you what's going to happen. I can't promise you you're going to get through the week on those brakes. I don't know what's going to happen. You could fail this week. You could fail 6 months from now. Right? But I just can't predict. I'm getting a brake job. Right? If my mechanic isn't telling me those brakes are safe, if he's telling me I can't tell you what's going to happen if you can keep driving on those brakes, I'm going to get a brake job. We all know that. So in order to continue business as usual, you would have to be dead certain, more certain than actually any scientist has ever been about anything, that everything all the scientists are saying are wrong. Uncertainty actually ought to be an argument for action. Yeah.
What you're getting at is the issue of risk and how we each integrate risk into our lives, and we do it in different parcels and different parts of our lives. We're all, across that spectrum of personalities, we deal with risk differently, and that's the political realm. When we looked across the UK, US, and Canadian responses to those sets of questions, they were fundamentally political questions about perceived risk. And to go back to what a group like this might do, how does this group contribute to its understanding, not only of the general elements of risk in the population, but even within our own judgment with respect to these types of questions. You can't help but, as an individual, struggle against our own value systems and our own psychological traits, let alone in the broader society. So I'm with you on all the evidence and the analysis, and oh yeah, I've done all that. But fundamentally, I've moved from being the scientific realm to the psychological and political realm in trying to understand why people end up where they do. And that's really the struggle, I think, especially scientists. Our comfort zone is data and interpretation, not the psychological and value.
Yeah, Gary.
Just one comment on your first question from earlier. And I forget who the lady who did the presentation was, but 2 years ago at Western, the master's program for sustainability, we had an expert come in, and all she talked about was translating scientific data for politicians and businessmen especially. The whole discussion was on this. So it was very interesting, and I don't remember a lot of it, but that's what the topic was, right? Because I do this every day, right? I work here, I advocate for here in London, quality water bans, fluoride, whatever. And that is, you have to translate your scientific information to a city councilor, because it really doesn't matter who else you're discussing it to. They're the decision maker. I can convince 5,000 people here in the city this is a bad thing. It doesn't matter. If the councilor doesn't vote yes, you lose it. So you have to have that personal relationship. There's no other way around it. And what the other side tends to do, and we're doing it too, on the, and first of all, I did have one comment though. I mean, if an ice age is going to take place by 2040, I would certainly say that was drastic climate change. I'm not quite sure why we would consider it that. But anyhow, I'm just a point. So one of the fights we had 6 years ago, I think, was we wanted to stop more drive-throughs being built in London. Okay? And Nestle, McDonald's, everybody, banded together. They spent well $1 million just in London on lawyers' fees and PR. But they didn't fight the question we were fighting. The question was we wanted to stop more drive-throughs being built. They framed it as we wanted to eliminate all drive-throughs. Well, we didn't have $1 million PR budget for television, and we lost that argument. We lost that fight, right? Because we weren't at the stage. But if you look at the big picture of the oil sands, and this was a deliberate thing, a lot of people don't realize that, is that the fight about 3 or 4 years ago, we moved it away from fighting the oil sands directly. And we moved it towards, and Bill McKibben, and this was a high-level strategy, it was moved to, let's stop the pipelines and the transportation of the oil. Because if you can't find new markets for it, which tends to be China, then we, by default, stop the expansion of the tar sands. Right? We're not going to close it. We will stop the expansion. And there is no larger single source of CO2 in this on the planet. There's nothing we can do. It's a disaster for this world. So that was that was us changing the frame of the argument there, saying, we're no longer going to fight saying tar sands is bad. We're going to go out there and fight against Line 9. We're going to go out and fight against the BC oil pipelines. Because if we can stop the town, then it automatically slows down the expansion. So that's the environmental groups evolving and moving to the stage where we're going to reframe the argument from time to time as well.
Well said, Gary. I have to go. Good night, everyone. Thank you
Good
very
night.
much. I'll see you
Can I
next week.
comment on your idea about the friction to brakes in the car? You might, I'll just comment on, it's the idea you're trying to suggest is that we should do something. We got this problem, we gotta do something. But what if the other perspective, like I told you, 2040, well, he didn't say it's going to go into a major ice age. A major ice age is a 5-degree change. About half a degree or two, maybe a 2-degree change, will go into what we call a little ice age. And if that's the case, these people that are saying this aren't running around like the other groups saying, well, we've got to collect some taxes to get a bunch of ships to get us down to the equator. I mean, that's as ludicrous as asking for a carbon tax. But we aren't saying that, are we? We're just trying to inform you of what the stats are.
Let's concede your entire argument. I will concede your entire argument. And let's say we still do something. Every economist there is say it will create more jobs. And what would the effects be? We'd have clean air, clean water, and farmland left to live on. Like, that's the only consequences of taking action.
Different topic. But we're talking about a different. We're in this climate change debate. We're saying the general thesis is to increase the CO2. You're talking about a greenhouse effect. It's going to cause the climate to increase.
Okay.
That is that.
Let's say we're all wrong, and we still take the actions. What are the consequences of actually doing something?
Because you're going to hurt the economy for the opposite
But every
reason.
economist says that's not true.
Yeah.
Economy isn't.
I say you collect the taxes, and if you want, build a bunch of big ships. I don't know. It's just a joke.
Yes. Oh, sorry. You had your hand up first, I think. Then I do, yeah.
I wonder if there's not a danger that we're implicitly overstating the importance of public opinion in terms of its impact on public policy in matters that affect trillions of dollars of corporate potential, revenues, right? It seems that in Canada, at least, there's already a majority who believe that industry is causing climate change, and yet, of course, Canadian policy is going completely in the opposite direction in complete defiance of public opinion. Right? And so it seems that there's not this correlation between winning the argument with public opinion and bringing about policy changes that align with that, when doing that would be adversely affecting these big corporations and their assets. So I wonder if not, in a way, worried about some of the wrong things here. Not that they're not important, also, but they're not necessarily by any means sufficient.
Well, I think there's a reason why ExxonMobil is worried about public opinion and spending all that money to influence it. I think there's a reason why Stephen Harper doesn't want climate scientists talking to the public, because even though they want us to feel like there's nothing we can do to affect things, I think that that's not true. Canada's at least nominally a democracy. We can vote. We can vote out this government and get a new one. I mean, it's true. You've got a majority government that can do pretty much whatever they want, but that's not going to be the case forever. And the thing about the transition to sort of new economy that Gary's and other people are talking about, transition to more livable cities where we don't have to get in the car every time we want to go somewhere. Transition to to renewable energy. The initiative isn't going to come from the big energy companies say, okay, we're going to move to renewables, right? And they invest a little bit of money in renewables, but that transition isn't going to come from them because they still got that $27 $27 trillion of assets that go away if it's going to remain in the ground. But change can happen starting from the grassroots level, and I think that's the reason why these people are spending so much money to influence public opinion. Yeah, what do you say?
Yeah, I had a question going back to your discussion with your climate scientist saying it was your fault.
Right.
And I think the implication there is that some level of increase in scientific literacy among the public will kind of benefit public discussion in some way. And I wonder how much that's true. So I have, the gentleman over here said something about a 3.6 or 3.2% contribution of CO2 from industry per year to the environment, or to the atmosphere. I have no basis for judging whether or not I should be impressed by that.
Well, just look it up.
My mortgage is 2.95%, and I still see the impact. It's a smaller number. So I have, the number does not impress me. I want to know about the effect, but I have no way to judge as a non-scientist what that impact is going to be. There's no reasonable way of recourse for me to look at that and make a judgment one or the other. So what it's going to come back to in many cases is authority, which is a suggestion both from you and from the gentleman sitting over here. I should look up some impressive paleoclimatologists. I should look at the credentials of people making statements on promoting the fact that there is climate change and so on. So that's an issue of rhetoric, not an issue of science. So what level of increase in my scientific literacy would allow me to shift the frame from making this a problem of rhetoric to a problem of science? And what kind of understanding would I need to really allow me to judge scientific arguments on their own terms, as opposed to simply going back to...
Obviously we're not all going to become an expert on climate science, and we're not all going to become experts on, every scientific topic that has impact on our lives. There's just not enough hours in the day. What I was suggesting, though, when I say read both sides, read the arguments both sides, is for a lot of it you just don't you don't have to just rely on authority, because the basic facts, a lot of the body of basic facts aren't in dispute. So someone tells you that the percentage of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, it's not a big percentage. The amount that we're increasing, it's not a big percentage. But is that relevant? Well, then look at the estimates of how good the carbon dioxide is at trapping that. So someone who just tells you carbon dioxide is a small percentage of the atmosphere, and those persons actually omitting the relevant facts, and you don't have to just take people's authority. You can see that. And it's similar with the Antarctic sea ice. Like when you first read that op-ed, so everything that person says in that op-ed is actually factually true. Not in dispute. The area of sea ice in the Antarctic is increasing. The op-ed was written to suggest that the loss of ice in the Arctic is being compensated by a comparable increase in the amount of ice in the Antarctic. And it's also uncontroversially true that that's false. I'm sorry. I guess it's uncontroversially accepted that that's false. Most of the, in the Antarctic, the sea ice is not where the action is. Most of the ice on the land. That person chose to omit that fact. Right? So, it doesn't actually take a lot of digging to notice that what a lot of these people are doing are telling you things that are true, but leaving out the salient details.
Yeah, but the opposite is true.
We have another hand over here. Yeah.
So what this comes down to is fundamentally a question of trust. For non-scientists especially, or for people who aren't immersed in a particular area of science, it comes down, how do you judge the veracity? Well, it isn't specifically on the content knowledge, it's on something else. And that's where the values come in, that's where the political alignment comes in. Having spokespersons who the public can understand and have empathy for, speaking in a way that, and framing the arguments in a way that's meaningful to the audience, not meaningful to us. We're just communicators of the ideas. And there's no simple answer, because it goes back to what I was suggesting before. It's about how we individually manage risk and interpret risk, and how the communicator communicates that risk and frames it for an audience. And this audience will be different than the audience next door. And it's a huge challenge to project into the future. We all do it in our own lives, right? So how do you do it? There's no certainty in this. There absolutely isn't. But the language of the street is different than the language of academics, fundamentally. And until academics, when they're asked to speak, understand that they're communicating with the street, not their peers, there will continue to be this gap, and it has to be managed. And it can be done through educating each other on how to communicate. Science for Peace does that, and through lecture series like this, that type of thing. And in these four, being open and having the exchange of diverse opinions work as it does in other contexts, but you're still having to communicate in a way that's meaningful to you, which would be different than others. No easy answers work. We have to figure out how to communicate it.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. I would like to bring up, speaking of an easy answer, I'd like to bring up a point, oh, I just lost it. about a point Mr. Murray today speaking. Einstein said a number of years ago, he said, if we don't have the birds and the bees, we've got 4 years left and we're gone. And Mr. Murray, who is our environment man this morning, just said that he's not going to investigate these nicotinoids or whatever they are. And if we don't have the birds and the bees, I kind of believe what Einstein was kind of a bright guy. And if we don't, I'm in solar energy. And if we don't have the birds and bees, why do we have to worry about what 3.5% is or whatever it is? We won't have a planet. And I think the words that are on the screen right now, we should be reading that and understanding that and doing something about it and getting rid of this Harper that's destroying our country and now going to war to kill people. I've been a victim. Thank you very much. I've been a victim of attempted murder 3 times by the London police on D-Day last year. And I'm fighting that. I got to go to court because of lying cops. And this was also in the paper just today, yesterday's Star investigation. Federal scientists failing to communicate. And it says here, quote, media policies in most agencies more restrictive than their counterparts in the U.S. study shows. And then departments leave scientists muzzled. And I'm a solar scientist. And it feels like to me that I'm being muzzled as well. Let's raise some hell around this city and this world to get what the fine words on that screen are saying to us right now.
Thank you. I think that's a good place to end on.
Thanks, Wayne.
Thank you.
What do you mean,
Yes. Sorry.